Good evening. I wanted to speak a little bit tonight about a little more about the contemplative life, because I recently referred to our practice as, and specifically zazen, as a contemplative practice. And, to contemplate means to observe, to regard, to ponder, to gaze attentively. And so I really think of it as looking deeply and reflecting upon that which is being seen. And so it is curious, and I think, a little unfortunate, I have mentioned this before, that to this day, there are people who believe that meditation is about not thinking, that it's about keeping thoughts at bay or stopping thoughts so that your mind is blank. This is actually almost a direct quote from someone that I spoke with not long ago. But, we know that the mind is not blank during meditation at all. That the mind is full, but stable. That the mind is full, but clear. And one of our miscellaneous koans says exactly that. Sitting in a room in absolute stillness, in absolute silence, mind source unmoved, filled like still water. So it's been one of my favorite koans, and that image of the mind filled like still water. Because I think it's exactly what it's like. What happens when we gaze attentively at the mind, at our thoughts, and we ponder, what is this? Like, what is a thought? What is mind? What is the thinker, the creator of thought? Or could it be the other way around? That the thought creates the thinker? And so zazen is a contemplative practice because it doesn't nest in the familiar. It doesn't let us take for granted what we think we know. It doesn't let us take for granted anything, in fact. It instead encourages us to investigate, to wonder, to study again and again, trusting that there is no limit to what the mind can apprehend. I really believe this, that there is no limit to what the mind can see, can grasp, can realize. And this is important because when we don't put a limit on our seeing, then a limit doesn't come up. That seems obvious. But perhaps what is not so obvious is that causal relationship, that we're actually the ones who set all sorts of limits on ourselves, and then we believe them to be real, to be true. But in fact, the problem is not that we set limits, but maybe that we don't do it skillfully, that we don't do it in such a way to help us realize that we are at heart limitless. And so my argument tonight is that there is a way of limiting ourselves that is useful, that is conducive to the enjoyment of the holy life, to use a phrase from the sutras. A kind of skillful limit setting, and that is really what the contemplative life is all about. And so there's a sutra called the Sumonyapala Sutta, the fruits of the contemplative life. And there's a king Ajatasattu, who's the son of King Bimbisara, who studied with the Buddha pretty early on. And, it must have been incredible to live at that time and have, a ruler of a kingdom actually studying with the Buddha. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be wonderful, amazing? No. And then it was, it was commonplace enough that there is King Bimbisara, and then there's his son, who is not quite there, but is wondering. And so one night, he's in his palace and he looks at the full moon and he thinks, how wonderful this moonlit night. How beautiful, how auspicious, how inspiring. And then he turns to his ministers and he says, who should we go see tonight who might enlighten us and bring peace of mind, bring us peace of mind? And, this is such an interesting start to a sutra. So there's this great king who I'm sure has everything he could possibly want. And he looks up at the moon and he is enchanted. But instead of just enjoying the night, delighting in that moment, he turns to his court and he says, so who can help us? Who can offer us some peace? In a way, bearing his heart, right? And so one of his ministers says, well, you can go see so-and-so. He's a really renowned teacher and he's getting on in years. And so if you want to study with him, you should do that soon. And the king, the sutra says, remains silent. And so another minister pipes up and says, well, you can go see so-and-so. There's this other great teacher. And again, the king stays silent. And then one of his ministers is sitting there and he's quiet. And King Ajatasattu says, why are you quiet? Jivaka, I think was his name. Something like that. He says, why are you quiet? And he says, well, I was thinking that the Buddha is nearby. And he's in this grove with 1,200 monks, 1,250 to be precise. He's the great honored one, the world honored one. Maybe you should go see him. And the king is like, yeah, okay. Let's go. And for whatever reason, he chooses to take 500 of the women of his court, riding on 500 elephants, and they all go to see the Buddha, the whole retinue. And so he wants to arrive at this grove, in state. I mean, can you imagine that sight? It's like 500 elephants with 500 female riders. But as he's approaching the grove, he suddenly gets afraid. I mean, the sutra is really just fascinating, the whole thing. He suddenly gets afraid. He gets scared because he's thinking, there's supposed to be 1,250 monks here, but I don't hear a thing. There's no sneezing. There's no coughing. There's no voices. And maybe this is a trap. And he turns to his minister, Jivaka, and he says, you're not deceiving me, are you? You're not leading me into a trap. This isn't like the enemy's lair, is it? And the minister says, no. Don't be afraid, my king. I'm not betraying you. Just go ahead. The Buddha's there. You'll see him. He's surrounded by his monks. And so the king goes in and he pays obeisance to the Buddha. So he knows enough, to know, okay, this is someone worthy of respect, even the respect of a king. But even in that moment before, everything he has, all his titles, his possessions, his power, doesn't protect him from his fear. Isn't that interesting? From his craving just a moment before, there's this beautiful moonlit night. I wonder who can give us some peace. And, I suspect that in some ways he knows that if he wanted to turn toward those things for refuge, his position, his power, his possessions, they all turn to dust. And so maybe he knows this, and maybe that is why he decides, okay, let's go see the Buddha. He has heard enough. I mean, probably he knew his father was studying with him. And so he thought, okay, let's go see what he has to say. But he still has some doubts, because the question he asks the Buddha once he is sitting in front of him is, look, I mean, there are horse trainers and elephant trainers, and there are charioteers and warriors and heroes. It's like us saying, there are politicians and doctors and lawyers, and they all live by the fruit of their labors. They have families, they give offerings, and they're happy. They seem happy. They look happy. But is there a similar reward, a similar fruit that you can point to for the contemplative life? I mean, I see that you're all practicing hard, but what do you get out of it? Because he still thinks that happiness is a thing you get. It's something you attain through hard work. And the Buddha says, I mean, did you ask anybody this question? And the king says, yeah. Purana said there's no merit at all. And then this other teacher, Makali, he told me, well, first I'm going to have to transmigrate through 1,406,600 births, 500 kinds of karma, 62 pathways, 6 great classes of birth, 8 classes of men, 4,900 modes of livelihood, 4,900 kinds of wonders, naga abodes, 2,000 faculties, 3,000 hells, 36 dust realms, 700 major precipices, 700 minor dreams, 84,000 great eons. And that's not even the full list. And once I get through all that, then I'll be free. And then he goes on listing the rest of the ascetics that he's seen. And everyone responds according to their insight, according to their understanding. And, this is one way in which the sutras would knock other teachers of the time, contemporaries of the Buddha, would knock their views. Be like, yeah, but this isn't quite right. And then, of course, he turns to the Buddha and he asks his question. And the Buddha says very simply, household life is cramped and dusty. The life gone forth is like the open air. Household life is cramped and dusty. He's saying this to a king. The life of the wanderer, of the home leaver, is like the open air. And in Zen, monastics are in Japan are sometimes called unsui, clouds and water, because they have no fixed abode. So it's a similar concept, similar understanding. Life in the world is busy, the Buddha is saying. It can be burdensome. But the life of a home leaver, the life of a contemplative, that's like open air. And then right after that, he describes how a monk, in this case, having gone forth, lives that contemplative life. And just to be clear, when I say monk, I mean men and women. In Zen, we use the term monastic, at least in the Mountains Rivers order. We would use the term monastic to refer to both, and then we would use monks for short. And the reason was to make it clear that there really was no distinction, no hierarchy, no difference in training between monks and nuns, which historically has not been the case. And so, since the time of the Buddha, and still in the Theravada school, the school of the elders, monks would follow 8 monastic precepts, many of which we're familiar with. Not killing, not stealing, not engaging in sexual conduct, so they are celibate, not telling lies, not taking intoxicants, not eating after noon, not wearing adornments, and not resting in high, luxurious beds, which really is not indulging in comfort, basically. But actually, in one of the sutras, the precept of intoxicants is very interesting, is replaced by one that forbids monks to store things for later use. So, if, for example, if I give a monk a banana, since they can't eat after midday, they can't store it either to eat it tomorrow. That's actually a pretty, it's a mid-level offense on the level of lying or using divisive speech or using intoxicants, for example. It's like, what? A banana? Like, why? And as I was writing this, I was reminded. I've told this story before of when I first went to the monastery. I think I had been there, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks. And one day, I don't know, I wasn't hungry for lunch because the meal times were set: 7 a.m, usually for breakfast, noon for lunch, and 6 for supper. And I don't know, I wasn't hungry for lunch, and so I turned to Jimon, the head liturgist. And I said, could I just have a banana? And she's like, no. And I was like, what? She's like, no, you can have lunch, but the meal that's being served, or if you don't want to eat, you don't have to, that's fine. But you can't just have a banana. And I was shocked, frankly, at the beginning, and offended because I didn't yet understand that what I was doing by entering into the virtue of harmony, the Sangha, the monastic community, which included us lay practitioners, was to cede my right to eat whenever I wanted. And instead to align myself with that harmony. And so, I think this precept is really saying, you do not store anything, you do not hoard anything, and you do not save anything for later, because you're completely trusting that in each moment, what you need will be provided. Sorry. That's a great level of trust. I mean, a banana is one thing, but a monastic does this in general. If you own possessions, land, you give them away. And at the monastery, we were not as strict with that. I mean, we could still handle money, which is not true of Theravada monks. We could handle money. I mean, I had a savings account that for about 20 years never had more than $200 in it. But, I had a little of something. And what happened when I actually left, I had a little more than 200 when I left, but I did have to rely. I didn't even think of it. And I was just thinking of this as I was sitting. It just came up. The people, a number of people who very generously, incredibly generously, came forward and just offered me a bit of a cushion so I would have something with which to start. That's the trust. That's the refuge, right? We've been speaking of. You take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, not in a bank account, not in a title, not in power. And to really live that way is not a small thing. It does require a tremendous amount of trust, of faith. But, if you look at it from the outside, it just seems like, constricting. All these other things that monks can't do. Don't do this, don't do that, refrain from this. How is that like living like open air? How does that lead to freedom and contentment? It doesn't. if we take freedom to mean doing what we want when we want. It doesn't if we believe contentment comes from what we have. But this is a good place, to slow down and to ponder what the teachings are saying, because we hear this so often, and it's easy to just let it flow through in one ear, out the other. I mean, yes, I know happiness doesn't come from the outside. I know I can't buy me love or peace or even a basic sense of calm. We know that. We agree. But then why do we keep trying, subtly or overtly? Why do I still expend time and effort on all sorts of external things? It's like those moments when you wonder, like what others think of you. You obsess about how you look. You worry about not having enough money. And I'm not saying, of course, they're to live anywhere in a monastery or the world. There are certain practical things that we need to take care of. But this is really speaking, the contemplative life really goes to the heart, to the spirit of how we approach that very life. But if we look again at it from the outside or on the surface, it could seem that, that limiting my pursuit of happiness in any way is a limitation, that it would feel limiting. And I think some of it, maybe just has to do with the wording. The original precepts: do not kill, do not steal, do not lie. So in a sense, it's really a wonderful and a stroke of brilliance that Master Dogen chose to add to the precept, the affirming side. And I was thinking, we have a new administration in our building, and they're constantly posting all sorts of updates, and they're on legal paper, so they're like this big, single space. Kira calls it Hogwarts, the Hogwarts newspaper, because every day there's like a new edition. And then they put televisions in the elevator, because apparently that's a thing now, with this looping cartoon sequence of all the things you cannot do. Don't turn on the music at night. Don't walk with heels, on your floor. Don't park outside of the lines. Don't go in the elevator wet. And all of the images, all of the cartoon people look scared, angry, scared and angry particularly are the two emotions. And Kira, who's a publicist, is like, this is terrible languaging. It's instead of being like, enjoy our pool from this and this side, from this time to this time, and just make sure to dry well before you go into the elevator, instead of don't do that because you might get electrocuted. They didn't quite say that, but almost. That's the image. And actually, the administrator, whom we have met, is like that. She moves through the world like this. So of course, this is what she sees. This is what she expresses. But of course, this is not what the contemplative life is. And the Buddha is essentially saying to the king, it's doing whatever you want, whenever you want, that's constraining. Following these apparent limitations, that's what will lead you to a life free as air. And of course, the question is, how is that? Because, we have no problem giving up all sorts of things, for goals that we can see. We understand that that's what it requires, that that's part of really doing anything worth doing. We have to make certain choices in favor of others. And so we give up things all the time, in fact. This is how people become Olympic swimmers or professional musicians or prima ballerinas. But the fruits of the contemplative life, they're harder to see, impossible to measure. So unless we're very clear that what we want is our own happiness and everyone else's, and our freedom, that what we really ultimately want is true lasting peace, then these precepts will feel like restrictions, like impositions. Unless we turn them inside out and we realize, oh, these are not the path to liberation. They're the expression of that liberation, that freedom. This is how a Buddha lives. Their free, unencumbered life. It's kind of what I said about goodness recently, right? When we think we're deluded, practicing good is hard work. When we know we're enlightened, then goodness is who we are. Goodness is what we offer the world when we get out of our own way. So it's the same thing with the precepts. And not just the precepts, but our liturgy, meditation. One who realizes the nature of all life as their own would be very cautious about taking it, very respectful. Someone reminded me recently of that story of Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, who would go to a grocery store near the temple where he was living, and he would pick out all the crooked and wilted vegetables. I think that's why his biography is called Crooked Cucumber. And one time, a truck, maybe the crate fell out or something happened. They dropped a whole crate of cabbages on the street, busy avenue. And in between, the cars speeding by, Suzuki Roshi would run in, save a few cabbages and pull them out. And there's, he's standing there, his arms full of wilted, flattened cabbages. He's like, the fresh ones will be bought. I feel sorry for these. One who understands that peace comes, it's the natural result, the natural expression of honest living, of not having anything to hide. It doesn't need to lie. It doesn't even come up. And so when you start to understand that, what I'm calling the contemplative life, let's say the life that is aligned with that liberation, with that deep desire that we have to be well, to be at peace. When every bit of that life is an expression of the ease that I find, that I unearth in myself, I would say particularly in zazen, but then hopefully that it begins to spill into all areas of our lives. Then it's not hard work at all. It's just the way we are. It's just the way we live. And that's the difference. The catch is we do have to realize that. And so we do have to create a container that makes it easier for us to see. And so each part feeds, nurtures the other. I do create my life in such a way to facilitate the realization of my nature. And as I do that, that life becomes the very expression of that realization. And then what begins to happen is that you find yourself hungering less for that which you don't have. You find yourself perhaps, not numbing yourself when there's something you don't want to feel, when you're facing something that is difficult. Maybe you don't reach so much for things to complete you because you realize you're already there. That's when we realize the mind was always filled. When it's unmoved enough for us to see it, we see that it was always filled. It was always fine the way it was, the way it is. We call this equanimity. And it's interesting that in the description of the jhanas, the deep states of meditation, equanimity is what remains when you move through everything else. You move through recollection and unified attention. You move through joy and rapture, what I've always called the rewards of meditation, where everything else is let go of. What remains is equanimity, a clear, stable, balanced state of being. The Stoics called it apatheia, or dispassion. But it's really a state that is free of that craving, of aversion, of fear. The Stoics would say that it's filled instead with discretion, which opposes fear, a kind of caution. And that it's filled with a kind of, we would call it aspiration. They said like a wish, that you wish for virtue and a life well lived. And the light or joy instead of that craving that comes from sensual pleasure. So you don't have to, not enjoy your life. On the contrary, you want to, but you're not caught by that constant craving. And so as he's describing the precepts to the king, the Buddha goes into great detail about all the many ways in which even contemplatives get caught. He says they're addicted to their stored up food and drink. And I don't know what the original was in the sutra, but the way it was translated, it's that actually they use the word addiction. They're addicted to watching shows like dancing and music, and they're addicted to idle games, to luxurious furnishings, large woolen carpets. When I was reading that, I immediately thought, with all due respect, I thought of the Vatican. Which is gorgeous and incredible, but also a bit shocking. They're addicted to speaking about lowly topics, to debates, to running messages for kings and ministers of state. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Very little has changed in 3,000 years. But really, what it boils down to is we get addicted to the self, to what the self can get. That's it. It's so simple, so obvious that it's painful. A contemplative, on the other hand, lives simply, just as a bird flies with its wings as its only burden. I love that image. With its wings as its only burden. And actually, the Buddha is saying this in the context of a monastic just having the robe. They're one robe, one bowl. They have few things, few desires. They know how to be satisfied. And so they are not burdened either by what they don't have or by what they have. A contemplative is mindful, alert, resolute, because they understand through and through what leads to happiness and what doesn't. And so they can take delight in a moonlit night, in a good meal, in intimate conversation. But they're not looking for the next hit. right? They're not scheming how to get more of a good thing. And just, it's a really good practice in that moment when craving arises, because it's pleasurable also, right? We want something, and that moment when we get it, there's that hit of pleasure. But to see if you can really zero in and feel how that feels underneath, the unease. It's not calm, it's not settled. Not in the way that joy can be, that delight can be of having a wish, meeting it, and the satisfaction, the fulfillment that comes from it, and not needing the next thing. That is it's a kind of a quiet fulfillment, but no less satisfying for that. And so, not scheming, not reaching, not craving, the contemplative can just focus their mind. They can develop insight and recollection. And all of this, the Buddha says, after what is a pretty long sutra, says all of this is the reward of the contemplative life, which is really the life itself. It's living it. I mean, that's the ultimate treasure. That's it, a life of peace. And when he hears this, King Ajatasattu is moved to confess to the Buddha that he killed his father for the sake of the throne, for the sake of power. And it's interesting because it was a full moon night. So the king is doing his mini fusatsu with the Buddha. He's atoning or trying to atone for his transgression. And the Buddha says, I accept your confession. He doesn't say, I forgive you, you're released from harm. He just says, I accept your confession. Now go do what you have to do. And with great respect, the king bows to the Buddha and he takes his leave. And once he's gone, he turns to his monks, the Buddha does, and he says, the king is wounded. He's hurt. If he hadn't killed his father, he would have woken up right as he was sitting in that seat. That's how the sutra ends. Actually, with the usual formula, the monks were delighted at the Buddha's words. But isn't that interesting? The king is wounded. And the other word is he's incapacitated. If he hadn't committed this grievous offense, he would have realized himself sitting here, listening to this discourse. It's almost like he's saying to all of us reading the sutra, take that. Whatever harm you've caused, that is what will keep you from ultimate peace, from liberation. And in a way, to me, this is, coming full circle to the practice of contemplation, the practice of creating the conditions, creating the container, creating the space to live and express that life with peace, and also to identify and remedy all that which is not that. All that we see, that we feel, that we understand now with renewed clarity gets in the way of us living peacefully and therefore kindly and lovingly. And the practice is to create that space, to set time aside, to cultivate silence, to practice doing each task with the same care and attention we give our zazen. And monastic life is it's an excellent container for this because it's all set for you. But lay life, if established carefully, deliberately, it can be just as conducive. The container has to be more open, right? More flexible, But the principle is the same. When we move through our days with our aspiration, that's what guides us. And that's what guides us. And so we sit zazen and we do a little bit of liturgy. Maybe we do caretaking each day. For some time now, I've gotten into the practice, the habit of doing caretaking for about half an hour to an hour, depending on what needs to be done after sitting and after liturgy, before I turn to writing. Just to care for my space. We do work practice, even if it's work that is not paid. We prepare a meal with respect. We eat it with reverence. We rest. We study. From the outside, it might not look like much. It might look like just ordinary life. But from the inside, it's everything. It's everything.